This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about plausibility. And this topic came up because Robert mentioned cozy mysteries and how, half the village is dead, but the baker still solves the crime. And I think in any genre you're writing, you need to ensure that whatever your protagonist is doing, whatever world you've built, there's a degree of plausibility, if not probability. So how do we as writers craft a story in such a way that readers still buy in to all of these improbable things that we're throwing at them? So, right. Robert, do you have any thoughts on this since you brought up the baker?
I think, at the end of the day, it comes down to immersing your reader in the story so that they can't do anything else except believe it. Mm-hmm. Because if you go back to what I believe we read for, which is some form of escapism, then we want to escape. We want to be convinced. We're already expecting the author to write, to transport us somewhere. Whether it is to being that crafty baker who always solves every murder, or whether it's to be through zooming through hyperspace, pursuing Klingons, or it's something that you want to be able to do. So, in a way, it's almost looking at what should I avoid doing. I don't want to pop the reader out of the story. I don't want to inadvertently break the fourth wall, because I'm trying to think of there's a technical term for this, and I can't remember it from NLP. But you don't want to turn the reader into the observer. So I know I'm talking about what we don't want to do. So the opposite of that then is making them experience everything.
Right.
And sometimes that has to be a little bit like boiling the frog. You've got to do it slowly enough so you don't have the granny picking up the gun in the first scene and confronting the murderer in the bakery. You don't have the dog whispering the clue. You've got to build up to these things. So that's my view of it anyway, is it sort of that you're coaxing the reader in, and I think that's why opening chapters, opening paragraphs, the first hook in any story, all of those things are really important, because especially if the reader hasn't experienced you as an author before, or maybe has, but in a different genre or a different voice, then you kind of got to, it's the whole, let me tell you a story. There was once a dragon, and half the kids go in the room and go, oh, another dragon story. So you sort of, it's a matter of meeting the reader where they are, and then taking them by the hand, and slowly that believability increases to the degree where all of a sudden you've got the granny in a fight scene in the middle of the book, and it makes complete sense.
Right. And I think as you're talking about meeting the reader where they are, it got me thinking about genre conventions. And if you're writing a cozy mystery, there will be crime, probably bodies, and we will have an amateur sleuth, and this person will solve the crime, and we will have some kind of cute fun along the way. So, and if you've got a thriller, you're taking some of those same elements, but in a very different direction, much more intense and dark. And so we expect our hero to be able to survive fights and, walk away with open wounds and continue the fight, and
it's just a
so on.
Wound.
Yeah. Oh, that, never mind, So some of those things that wouldn't happen in real life, we can get away with in our fiction because it makes that particular type of story more exciting and more appealing to that particular type of reader. But if you put, the knife fight in the cozy mystery and had your hero take a giant cut and have no repercussions, your readers will probably cry foul because it's not the type of plausibility issue they're looking for. Right?
Right. Right. And I think this comes down to like also remembering the limitations as well as the skills that you've given your character.
Mm-hmm.
So if your cozy mystery amateur sleuth is the baker, they probably are not going to have access to the police records and access to certain other things. And that's where, to me, you start getting plausibility issues. Like me as a reader, I'll be like, there's no way that they would get that. So give them another avenue to solving the crime that doesn't take the reader out of the baker would never know this.
Right.
You know, what is a baker? A baker is up really early in the morning, you know, getting ready for the day. Like maybe that's, you know, something that you could utilize, or, you know, things like that. Things that are within the realm of plausibility for that character that then can add to your story rather than pulling your reader out like, whoa.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I love how that brings us out of the superhuman abilities, like continuing to fight with massive wounds, and into the very real, mundane issues that our characters face, just like we face them in real life. You know, how am I going to do this? What kind of workaround do I need if I don't have those resources? So as writers, we need to constantly keep in mind our characters' roles, you know, professional in the community, as the sleuth or the whatever. What about other genres? I feel like we're picking on cozy mysteries here. I think in historical romance, we're going to expect to see issues of class come up. So the upper class, lower class romance, not so likely, not that it never happened, but, you know, pretty unlikely in reality. But we like to see divides bridged in our fiction, so that's a plausibility issue.
Yes, you've got to work out a way in the plot how that structures. So you often see them suddenly realise that they're not this poor orphan, that they've, you know, they actually have a legacy. Or so there's some orchestration in there if you want it to be a romance between opposite ends of town. In an era where there wasn't none of that, then you have to find a way to orchestrate it to make it believable. And I think that's perfectly doable. You know,
yeah.
I mean, again, we're every book is not reality. If it were, it would be super boring.
Right.
And so we're trying to. I mean, you know, I write science fiction, and there's no such thing as faster than light drive, yet almost every space opera writer is going to transgress that fundamental law of physics, and no one really ever asks the question. The question, in fact, in forums that's usually asked is, how did you deal with the faster than light thing? I just left it. Or in my case, I just talk about hyperspace because Asimov's used it forever and everyone understands it. So, you know, and there's a jump. But how does that work? Well, I don't need to explain it.
Right.
So I think you can use previous conventions to overcome those things as well, depending on the genre you're in.
Right, definitely. And that brings up the matter of suspension of disbelief. So if you're writing something like science fiction that has established genre conventions, you can have faith that your reader will suspend that particular issue for you in order to enjoy the story.
Yeah, and sometimes you risk actually popping them out if you try and over-explain it. This guy's wearing his science on his sleeve. You know, he's trying to explain something that's not physically possible, or trying to give some rationale. And unless it's super key to something later in the story where, you know, those anti-grav plates, you know, actually come into play because they're required, or the hero suddenly thinks of a way to utilize those, then there's no need for it. And if the convention's already established, you might as well just take the shortcuts. Like you say, Alida, with the cozies, you know, the shortcut is some of those conventions are, you know, obligatory scenes are already established for you. You know, you've got to write to them, basically.
Right. I think this is also where the first couple chapters in your book do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of expectations for the reader. If you don't introduce some of the things that are going to push the boundaries of plausibility early enough, like then if you throw them in the midpoint or throw them in towards the climax, it starts to feel like you're just all of a sudden the reader's like, wait a second, wait, there's magic? Like, why is there magic now? Or you know, or science fiction type stuff. Oh, wait a second, we can do that? Like, that wasn't introduced early enough. So if you are going to have, like, say, a character who has a really ridiculous high pain tolerance, and that has to be there for your climax, something has to happen early enough that your reader believes it is possible.
Anyway, well, yes. So what Kathryn said was,
wait, I think you're back.
A character with a high pain threshold at the end of the book, and that's really key. Then you've got to set that up somewhere in the beginning, even if it seems trivial. And I like also. I think Blake Snyder's work in Save the Cat is really good. I think that whole Save the Cat moment is a wonderful way to think about not just things that endear a character to you at the start of a story, but what do you need to have, dropped in that is just going to help that plausibility later on. As we've said before, if a character is particularly analytical or strategic, then if you can show them doing something with that isn't necessarily, mind blowing, or even we were talking about before where in a previous episode about traveling chapters, if you're trying to show a character being incredibly analytical and they're taking a bus trip and thinking about something, then you can have them picking out people in the street. Like, Jack Reacher does this, we'll look at characters and why is that woman not wearing a coat? It's, 10 degrees out there. And in fact, actually, I think one of the books starts that way. He's on a subway train where he observes some sort of kind of tics of a character, a female, and deduces from that she's actually wearing an explosive belt. And he uses all his time in the military, and so it's perfectly plausible. But how many of us would sit on a subway and kind of realise that the person opposite is a suicide bomber? It's
probably none of us. But
no, exactly, and yet with Reacher, it's because of his peculiar OCD nature. It seems to be perfectly plausible.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like the Sherlock Holmes character. His analytical skills are a sort of superpower that nobody else in the world has. And if you saw the again in the fight scene episode, we were talking about slowing action down. If you saw the Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr., I think it's a bare knuckle boxing scene where they slow it down kind of like in the Matrix where he's going super slow. Yes. But as the fight is happening so slow, there's this voiceover of Holmes thinking through everything the other guy is doing and how he should respond and where he should move and what he should, so you get that analytical processing happening in real time in the fight, except in order for it to be presented to an audience, they have to go super slow-mo. And that wouldn't work with another character because we wouldn't believe anyone else could analyze a fight in real time. We're going on instinct and, purely reactionary. So that...
And the reason you suspend disbelief in that scene is because it didn't come out of nowhere. We've already had that set up. And even if you've never known Holmes before, there might be people who saw that movie who have never read a Conan Doyle book or have no idea about what we would expect in culture as Sherlock Holmes' typical skills. But it might have been set up, I don't remember how it was set up, but, you can have a very simple scene where he observes somebody sneezing and, most of us would just go, oh, it's sneezing, move away. But he would, be observing, the creases in the tissue that was used and the droplets that didn't make it. And, all that, you could see the analytical mind. Yeah, that's right. So I think you're dead right. It's all a lot of the setup can be done subtly, and again, it's not necessarily something that's going to happen in first draft. You're going to come back and start seeding those things in because they need to be there.
Right.
It also seems like a lot of what we're talking about deals more with your character development than necessarily your world or anything like that. Like if your character has the right skills, experiences, etc., then your reader's going to follow their expertise and believe in their plausibility much more, no matter what else is going on in the world.
Right.
And another clever thing I've seen done as well is where the character mirrors the reader reaction. So the character has the disbelief. And so you can actually pace it in for the reader because the character doesn't believe it. Seriously, there's 800 of us and there's an advancing army of 10,000. What the hell? So and if the character's voicing that, the reader's going, yeah, damn right. I was wondering that too. How are they going to do that? So you can kind of, it can be part of the way that the story unfolds because, again, if you've got action adventure stories where heroes against impossible odds, you've got to find a way to make that believable for the reader. So the character might not believe it themselves, or one of the supporting characters may challenge it, and that's another good way of having potential either plot holes, because every plot's got a hole, dispensed with so that the reader can move on.
Yeah. So what about plausibility issues in the setting or in the world building? Are there... So I think in talking about character, we've also touched on plot, right? Because the plausibility seems to mostly come with how the character is dealing with these plot issues. So what about setting and world building? Any plausibility issues there?
Yeah, I've heard people who are in specialist professions complain that when they read some books or watch some TV shows or movies that the character is playing. I know we're talking about characters still, but the setting is important. The role and the setting they've been placed in doesn't exist in real life.
Right.
So, a forensic specialist who ends up being the murder investigator just doesn't happen.
Right. Or the forensics lab that has, super high-tech equipment that maybe doesn't even exist. Or if it does, it's only at the topmost, federal level. And
or the when the detectives go into the morgue and stand around the slab and the body, and that just doesn't happen. So they would normally sit in an office and read a report or be on the phone. No need for them to go to the morgue.
Right, except we were talking about the traveling chapters and how to make those more interesting. So sitting around the office and talking on the phone, not as interesting of a way to get that information in front of the reader, but have them standing around the morgue with the body on the slab, more interesting, so we can see why writers make that choice.
Exactly. And probably all of us think that's how it's done.
Well, yeah, because we all believe everything we see on TV.
Yeah. So we've been convinced. We've suspended our disbelief. We think, oh yeah, well that's what happens. The detectives walk in there and in this completely what do you call that? A sanitized environment, and they just walks on in.
Right. I think in world building, we have to look at the rules we set up. Kathryn was talking about the early chapters doing heavy lifting. So if you're writing a fantasy with magic in it, for instance, then you need to establish the rules of that world and how magic functions. And so then if you break that rule, you create a plausibility issue where the reader's not going to buy into that scene anymore.
And you have to do it vicariously, I think, as opposed rather than through exposition, or at least if you're doing it through exposition, then it's the old exposition as ammunition thing where characters are either discussing it or demonstrating, or that's why you see in so many of these YA heroes journeys, you have the middle section of the book as a giant training montage, because they have to pick up all the skills along the way, but you can't just tell the reader. You've got to show it so that they can then come of age at the end and take on the big baddie. I think if you show it vicariously, then again, I'll think back to I was mentioning another episode about the Codex Alera. It's interesting that some of the magic in there just seems so mind-blowingly vast, and yet he's quite cleverly introduced some limitations. So you have people who can move the ground and lift giant walls out of the earth and turn them into stone. But if they lose contact with the earth, so if they're suspended in a a metal cage, they can't do a thing.
Right.
So, so I think the rules are important if you're going to have particularly powerful, same in science fiction, you've got these incredible weaponry. Well, then why didn't they just go and, blast the villain into some other dimension?
Mm-hmm.
Just a powerful weaponry. Well, there must be some reason why. So I think that's where the disbelief is like the hero running with a wound that would have most of us bleeding out within seconds.
Right.
There's always going to be something, and you've got to try and get around.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to plausibility, know your genre conventions, know your character's roles, know your character's abilities that you've assigned him or her, and understand the rules of the world that you have established in your opening chapters. Anything else we need to keep front of mind as writers when we think about the plausibility issue?
Well, you mentioned it before, I think, Ken, in a different episode about continuity.
Yes. Yep.
So you've got that as well. I mean, if they suddenly pull out that, paging device that is in their pocket, then we need to have known before that was still with them, or they didn't, or when they dropped it. If they dropped it in the water before, well, how come that's now working again?
Yes.
So,
that
sort of thing.
Yeah, continuity is also a big one. And I think it's important for us to remember what our heroes' vulnerabilities and flaws are as well, so that we aren't always just, winning, fighting, beating, doing, but so that we also factor that into the realness of our story.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's a good way to introduce more plausibility is when, we have a deficiency in the hero and it results in a problem for them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. They're being true to their character. So it seems we do keep going back to characters, doesn't it, for the plausibility thing?
It does. Yep. Kathryn, any final words for us? You've been nodding so quietly.
I have a very enthusiastic child. She agrees.
Oh,
that
good.
The character is the center. So,
all right.
Give us a character you can fall in love with, and we'll believe anything they do.
Ooh, excellent. Well said, Aria. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.